God is not a huge proponent of slavery in the Bible. This is a free will question, somewhat like question 3. Slavery is a fact of life, due to our tendency toward evil. As well, the concepts of slavery and indentured servitude frequently are overlapped and misunderstood in context.
Question 5. Why is God such a huge proponent of slavery in the Bible?
I would encourage you to study what slavery was in biblical terms. It was nothing akin to the African slave trade we had in America and around the world. Biblical slavery was more akin to indentured servitude, whereby a person owing money or restitution to another entered into an agreement to work for them for a specific period of time. 6 years. Sounds a lot like a contract to me. I need money. I agree to work for a company for 6 years, and in turn they pay me $45,000 a year. A slave was not to be mistreated, and anyone who did mistreat their slave was dealt with harshly. First, I would ask that you read Exodus 21:16, since you're in the area.
Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession.
This pretty much would have ended the African slave trade, if it had been adhered to. Slavery was a universal practice at the time, and God knew that it would be impossible to eliminate it in one generation, much like America's founding fathers, so instead he limited and humanized it. Much like divorce, it is not his preference, but as man is flawed he accepts its existence. By scripture, a slave servant was to be treated as a member of one's family. In fact, they are included in the 10 Commandments. You are forbidden to work your servants on the Sabbath. The very fact that if a slave chose to flee they were to be protected, and not return would rein in even the most abusive a person's tendency to be cruel. If a person were overly cruel the slave could flee and seek protection. If the servant slacked off, and was not providing full benefit to the person he served, the person was permitted to punish him, much like you might spank a defiant child. If the person were to take this punishment the servant could flee, and be safe, and if the owner were to kill the slave he was dealt with harshly, unlike the African slave trade, where the master suffered no penalty. While this was not perfect it did give slaves rights, and an ability to escape harsh conditions. As an aside I would like to point out, that the majority of the abolitionists were devout believers in Scripture, and in fact used it as their basis for decrying the African slave trade. A side note if I might. This argument does in no way suggest the non-existence of God. You could say that this argues that God is not good, or that he is not just, but to say that this disproves God's existence is coming to an irrational conclusion. It's like saying the Constitution allows for slavery therefore Thomas Jefferson never existed. I wish you would take the time to read this verse in context, since all it is saying is that whatever you do, do it to the best of your ability, as you are a reflection of God and your reward is not of this world but the next. This is saying the same as the last verse. Next time read the context and save your time and mine. Just because the word servant or slave is there doesn't mean God said, go buy a slave, have a great time, beat them, I don't care. Your ignorance is showing with such absurd citation. You need only go back 3 verses to understand what is being said here.
For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people.
I beseech you please take the time to look at context.
And why do all intelligent people abhor slavery and
the most educated in both Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia were the most avid supporters of Nazism and communism, and these two doctrines seem to enjoy it. They choose not to use the name, but in practice they were the same. Take a look at the conditions of people in Soviet countries, or under Mao in China, or Nazi Germany. The conditions endured by people in these secular intellectual countries rivals that of any slave. And again the biggest supporters of these doctrines were the most educated of the people in the countries.
And make it completely illegal. You have to come up with some kind of weird rationalization to explain it.
to you everything is some kind of weird rationalization, unless of course I make the leap, that there is no God. You call it rationalization, I call it reasoning. By the way, this is also another classic straw man fallacy. You, like most of the other people attacking Christianity, like so much to equate the slavery mentioned in the Bible with the slavery that happened, for example, in the United States in the past. Just because the same word, slave, is used, does not automatically mean the situations were comparable. In the United States, slaves had less rights than animals, and were complete property of their masters. If, for example, the master wanted to beat, rape or kill his slaves, he could just do that with impunity. Slaves usually lived in their own quarters, often in conditions worse than dogs. Slaves had next to no protection from law. Slaves in the Old Testament were in a rather different situation. They were protected by law, and if their master abused them, the master would get a punishment. Slaves usually lived in the same house as their master, in the same conditions, and they could buy their own freedom if they wanted to. Moreover, the law demanded that slaves be freed each 7 years. Regardless of this, many of these slaves decided not to leave their masters, because they were so well treated. Their conditions were much closer to modern servants than to slaves. But of course all who want to attack Christianity will ignore all this, distort the Bible, equate slavery in the Bible to slavery in the United States, and dismiss any alternative explanation as rationalization and nonsense.